Healthcare is too expensive. Employers are offsetting costs onto their employees. Who will make health benefits affordable for hardworking Americans and their families? You will. This is the Empowering Plans Podcast, a show dedicated to helping you once again emphasize the benefit in benefit plan. Now prepare to learn, plan, save, and protect with the Phia Group.
Welcome to another episode of Empowering Plans Podcast. My name is Timothy Pope. I'm a staff attorney in the Provider Relations Department here at the Phia Group. I'm joined by Garrick Hunt, who is a sales manager with Phia Group. How are you, Garrick?
I am good. And Tim, correct me if I'm wrong. This is both of our first times doing a podcast, correct?
It's certainly mine, Garrick.
You know, I think it's going to be funny is when folks hop on to listen to this one, they're not realizing they're about to get the amateur hour at the Apollo Theater today. But we'll do our best.
Yeah, hopefully the amateur hour doesn't jump off like we think it might. So the theme of this particular podcast today is the lockdown and its effect on children with disabilities. So a slightly off-topic departure from what these podcasts typically touch upon, plan, document, reference-based pricing programs. But we felt as though, given everything we've been through over the last year, would be a nice departure and a good topic to touch upon. Now, obviously, almost a year ago, with the impact of the coronavirus and the subsequent lockdown of essentially all of society, there were immeasurable impact on all various facets of life, particularly people with children with disabilities. The impact was immense. Obviously, part and parcel with the lockdown was the closing of the vast majority of in-person education. They closed the schools. And as we look to this topic, and as we look to the impacts that the lockdown has had on children with disabilities, there's a couple of key points that jump out. Before I turn it over to Garrick, I'll just go over some bullet points that we've noticed that have developed in nearly the year since the shutdown. First and foremost, by removing in-person schooling and in-person education, the routine and structure on which children with disabilities thrive was taken away from them. In the sense they had the rug taken out from under them. They were cut off from school. They were cut off from their teachers. They were cut off from their friends, and their routine was thrown into turmoil. Children with disabilities, particularly mental health disabilities, rely on that routine. They rely on that structure. And without it, unfortunately, we come to our next bullet point, there's regression. Not only have parents of children with disabilities seen a stalling of developmental process, but indeed a regression of that development. In a sense, one step forward, two steps back. Children's language skills, socialization skills have unfortunately worsened because they're not exposed to that in-person educational experience. And unfortunately, doctors and parents have seen an increase in depression, anxiety, aggression, and suicidal ideation. While in school, the educational structure serves to, in a sense, calm some of those symptoms, or at least decrease them. And unfortunately, as we come to our next point, it's pretty widely believed that the response by many school departments has been woefully inadequate. Not only is online learning generally inadequate for disabled children, as they can't focus, they have a difficult time adapting to a computer type or Zoom-based education, but many parents have found that the lack of education from the school departments seriously hampered their ability to teach their children. For example, you read articles of parents receiving a one-page instruction form from school and really nothing else. And maybe at times efforts to follow up with those school departments has fallen on deaf ears, so to speak. And as a result, not only have we seen a marked increase in stress on the children, but also stress on the parents. They're now asked to serve as a teacher, as a therapist, as an occupational therapist. But as we all know, those are highly trained individuals, and the parents are really just the parents in many respects. And so this has added stress to them. And indeed, many disabled children refuse to accept their parents serving as teachers. They won't accept that particular role, and they push back. Unfortunately, parents are burnt out, and they do, as I mentioned before, feel almost abandoned by school districts. They're trying to juggle their jobs. They're trying to juggle caring for their disabled children. They're trying to juggle caring for their other children and dealing with financial stress that unfortunately has come with this lockdown. And they oftentimes have felt like there's no one to turn to. For the individuals who were able to obtain in-person home therapists, tutors, there was always that underlying concern that, are they going to be bringing the virus into their household? Is it not safe? My last bullet point that I'll come to is just an overall decreased socialization that the children unfortunately are experiencing. As I mentioned before, they're not seeing their family, they're not seeing outside family, they're not seeing their friends, they're not seeing their teachers. Familiar faces that would greatly assist them with their development. Many kids feel like they're being punished by being told, no, you can't leave the house. They just simply don't understand. Even something simple as a family member coming over to sit and just be with the children. Those individuals themselves are self-isolated. And I think in terms of this particular topic, this hits home very much for people. And I think, Garrick, this hits home for you as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, you mentioned in your initial statement, one step forward, two steps back, and that really resonates. For folks listening and those who know me personally know that my oldest son is diagnosed autistic. And that, in the best of times, is always a kind of world shaking kind of eye opener because you never know what you're supposed to do, right? Imagine being first time parents and then seeing things. So, just a little background, we started noticing behavior and certain elements. One of the things that my son displayed very early on was, I think, echolalia. And so when he would speak to you, right, think about the basic question, I would like juice, or I would like to play with a toy, or I would like to go outside. He wouldn't ask those questions. He would mimic copy both the timbre and the kind of tonality that we would ask the question to him. So it wasn't, Mama, can I have juice? It would say, you would like some juice, Rowan? And he would say that to us. And that was his means of asking to have some juice. And he would do that a lot. We also saw a lot of peculiar activity with self stimulation, particularly around visual stimulation. He would move objects real close to his eyes, or he would lay on his stomach to see things. Even when he would meet a child, at a playground or something, this is obviously pre COVID when I bring this example up, a child would come up to say hi to him and he would lay on his stomach and kind of position himself to see just at the means where the base of that child's sneaker touched the ground. Right. So these were some peculiar things. And as we started exploring it, and thankfully we have an occupational therapist within the family, and using her guidance, I mean, I can't even say without her guidance how we'd even start. I mean, just let's talk about, access in the healthcare system is confusing at the best of times. I mean, that's a kind of a normality that we all see every day, especially, with the positions that you and I work in, Tim, right? Now, imagine, my wife and I shocked to try to figure out how we were going to get our son diagnosed, and especially difficult when children are small. They're kind of moving targets. How do you delineate between what's just normal children behavior and what is a sign of something more concerning? So fast forward a year later, we went through all the testing, which took a better part of 3 or 4 months, multiple sit down conversations, interviews with myself, my wife, my son, observations both in home and at a clinical office. And they came to the conclusion that, he did meet that and had some developmental delays. Particularly, he had a lot of fine motor skill development delays. He had a strong eating aversion and a food aversion, which is a whole other problem to deal with, especially in a lockdown scenario. And, moving forward, we were able and grateful enough to work with the public school system, develop an IEP, an individual education plan, tailored to his needs, and of course had been undergoing in-home ABA therapy. And so let's talk about pre-COVID for a moment and kind of what our routine looked like. You mentioned routine is one of the first bulletins, and that is it. And that's really where I tie routine right into the one step forward, two step back statement, because it takes infinitely more work to get a child to develop in a positive trajectory, right? To get them to start displaying the behaviors that you're looking for, right? Trying to, increase attention span, diversify his appetite, especially when they have a food aversion. It's very difficult to try to introduce new foods to them. Trying to get the communication skills and social skills up to par so that they can interact with their peers and others. It takes years of work to get him to a point where he was, operating at that capacity. And you can derail and regress in a third of that time, right? So it's faster to go back than it was to go forward. And that really was the struggle that we dealt with. So when the lockdown hit, we went from having, pre-COVID, 30 hours of in-home ABA therapy. He went to school 4 days a week. And we're talking, this isn't like 8 a.m. to 12 p.m. like a kindergarten kind of thing. I mean, he was 4 full days a week plus the in-home ABA therapy. That was a lot of stuff that we did with him. These are all done by professionals. These are occupational therapists. These are speech therapists, educational professionals who do this stuff every day. I am not. Those who know me at Phia, I'm just a wisecracking sales guy. right? That's what my job is. I'm not an educational professional. I don't have an advanced degree in this stuff. And it's complicated. You sit in these meetings and they throw out these terms and try to lay out these plans, and it's difficult. So when COVID hit, it wasn't like we kind of went into like a reduced environment. I mean, it went from 100 miles an hour to a solid hard stop. And so we went from having, my son accessing these services and having these professionals in our homes helping my son every day to zero, not having any access whatsoever to any of these resources. And that created a huge strain, both not only on part of me and my wife now having to play dual roles. I mean, you mentioned parents turned teacher, right? And the words are synonymous in some ways, as parents we're all teachers, but certainly not in the way that my son needs it. And we were given, these thick work packets with all of this information, and then we were given like a 1-page or 2-page instructions of what to do. And I work, and thankfully I'm one of the Americans out there who has the ability to work from home, and I don't have to really have that harder struggle on the economic side like many of the other Americans out there are facing. But now all of a sudden you're trying to split your duties. You're trying to work from home and do your job, and you're also trying to take care of your family. But now on top of that, I'm trying to make heads or tails. My wife's trying to make heads or tails of all this educational material. And I mean, you're a father of 3, aren't you, not Tim?
I sure am, Garrick. I have 3 boys. They're age 5, 3, and 8 months. In one sense, Garrick, I can't relate. They do not have any mental disabilities. But, I, like every other American with children, had to deal with the lockdown and as best we could as well.
Right. I mean, basically, the point being is it's challenging even in the best case scenario. So now you think about this void that has now appeared because we don't have access. The regression started rapidly. We would get more and more non-compliance. We were unable to successfully introduce any of the new food plans. Because, I mean, when you try to introduce something new, especially to a child with a particular learning disability or an aversion, like in this case, certain textures and colorations, it takes months to do it. It's not as simple as dumping it on the plate and saying, eat this. It's just not how it works. And it's not easy, even with the professionals. Now, all of a sudden, my wife and I are trying to get him to eat a banana, and we don't even know where to start. And so, on top of that, there's that immediate stress factor, right? Because now we are feeling that as parents, and I know as a rational adult, I understand that some things are out of my control. But you can't help in the back of your mind to feel that you're letting your child down. And I know that's not the truth, but it's hard, especially for people like my wife and myself, it's hard to try to shake that thought from your mind. And that just adds the stress on top of the fact that you had mentioned, the social disconnection, right? Social structures and developing social skills, it's kind of like riding a bike. You could read books about how to ride a bike all day, every day. Every book written by the greatest bike experts on earth, if such a things exist, right? You read these books, but you never sit on a bike. And what you read on paper and then what you deploy in reality are often two different things, right? Social structures and social skills are the same way. You could practice and practice and practice, but there's always a level of comfort the child's going to have with me as an adult and as the parent, right? He sees me every day. There's always going to be a level of comfort. But if you take away the social aspect of his day-to-day life, interacting with friends, family, interacting with his teachers, and having to be in a social environment, when you take that away, you're not getting that practice, that very important, difficult to replicate practice. And so just from the social skills, right, you could see sentence structure regression. You could see, increases of things like, self-soothing or self-stimulation starting to become more and more apparent. And as those activities happen, and I will say this, and I say this with all the love of my child, when your child is standing at the top of the stairs at 6:30 in the morning, just yelling, nonsense at the top of his lungs because it's self-stimulating for him, it's really, really hard to have that well of patience that you have to exhibit on a day to day, because now not only is my child cut off from the world and his social world, so am I. And so now we have this feeling of kind of entrapment, and we're cooped up inside, and there's so much information out there, and a lot of negative news out there. It's really hard to keep that well of patience full. So when you have your son standing there making this noise where normally you're able to tolerate and quickly de-escalate and walk through, you lose it, and it's so difficult to manage. And that's just from the early stages when there was nothing. But as you know, Tim, I'm sure as time went on, you have the whole reopening phase, right? Schools are now starting to reopen, maybe at limited hours. And they started, in our case, for his learning plan, the school that he goes to and the school system, they had a process in place for children who do not require these types of special services. We didn't hear anything about his IEP for almost 4 weeks. So while everyone else was going to school or having online learning, we weren't told anything. And then finally, when we were told something, it was in the form of we just got a random invite through our email to get on a Zoom class. So now all of a sudden, we're going to drop everything. Now we have to get on the Zoom class tomorrow. We don't know what to expect. And then you get on the class, it's an hour long, it's 45 minutes of everyone trying to wrangle their children, taking calls in the background, trying to step away from work, get the children on the call, which is, it became very fruitless. And we found that there was little to no value in it at that point. And then it was like that for a while. And then eventually they started opening up, and wouldn't you have it, literally the first, I think, 2 weeks when they opened schools up again, a little bit of reduced capacity. My son goes for like the 2 weeks, and I can't make this up. We got a call from the superintendent 2 weeks later saying that a child who had gone to the elementary school had tested positive for COVID. And literally, we all had to then go isolate again for 2 weeks. And there was this whole COVID testing thing we had to do. And if any kid had a sniffle and couldn't go into school, they needed to have a COVID test. And, there's only so many times you can put your child through that process before it just becomes like enough is enough. And unfortunately, that's kind of how a lot of it went down. And even with the ABA therapists, we have these therapists who come into the house, and they're great people. I have absolutely the highest amount of respect for what they do. But at the same breath, they're meeting other children, other families. And I can't control what goes on in the lives of other homes and other parents and other children, right? I don't have no control over that. And, you're rolling the dice in some degree of saying, okay, my child needs these services. We certainly want these people to be here. But what if we roll the dice and it comes up bad, and now all of a sudden, God forbid, we have a situation where the family's infected? It's really hard. And I think that was the toughest part of the whole process is my wife and I sitting there trying to figure out, what do we do and what is the best thing? Do we risk potential infection and have these people come in and give my son the treatment he needs? Or do we forego the treatment until we can be certain that he can be safe when they come in? So, that's been my personal experience. I can't say for certain if it's everybody's, but I mean, I remember you and I read a article I think you shared a while back that was in the New York Times from mid 2020. And as I read it, it was funny. Is literally looked to my wife and I said, is this something that you wrote? Because it felt like I was reading my own experience, in this article, because it was just that spot on, with dealing with regression, dealing with behaviors that are starting to crop back up again, feeling that all of the work you've put in for 2 years has now basically been unraveled in a year's time or a few months' time. And then having to balance the stress of, what do you do? Do you do a risk here? Do you do a risk here? Do you bring people in your house? Do you not bring them in? And then, of course, I recently had my second son 3 weeks ago. And so my wife was pregnant during the pandemic as well. And that put her at risk, which made this even harder. So it was definitely a difficult scenario that I've been in. And I think a lot of what you said in the beginning and some of the articles that you and I have been looking at over the last couple of weeks have been pretty telling and pretty spot on from my experience.
One thing I think, as you discussed your experience, you talk to your friends, you talk to your family members, you talk to anyone who has children, talk to educators, you talk to doctors. One thing I think was clear before this lockdown and has been now doubly clear is that there really is no substitute for in-person education. As you indicated, Garrick, and even I had experience of some of it with these Zoom classrooms. The younger kids especially have a difficult time focusing on class, focusing on the teacher, and that's even more difficult when you do have a child with disabilities. And as I indicated earlier on, that in-person education, the professionalism and the skill of the teachers, even just the peer environment, serves to calm the children, serves to focus the children, and even with children with disabilities, you can't put a measurement on how vital in-person education is to children.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I mean, I have friends and I have family with much older children, and I will say that at least from the older children's perspective, where they have a little bit of that development and maturity already in place, that they are able to have some self-study and some self-control when it comes to focus. Certainly not present in much younger children, even children with don't have any mental disabilities or learning disabilities or any kind of specialized education needs. So you're right on. I mean, the online environment is certainly a novelty and there is value in it. It just deployed for everybody. The one size fits all mentality, it doesn't work very well because there's always going to be nuances and needs based on the children, based on the parents. And I mean, fortunately, Tim, you and I were talking not too long ago about how, at least thankfully, we're both in positions where, you know, we're in a financially stable position. We're able to work because we have the ability to work from home, which again, that's one of the big advantageous elements of this whole thing is that, you know, more and more companies are realizing the value and the capabilities of being able to work from home. So that is a nice little silver lining. And while that's good for us, there are many Americans out there, probably greatly more than us, who don't have that luxury. I think just based on that, it wouldn't surprise me if there's going to be a significant utilization of the healthcare space from the mental side and the RX side when all of this kind of comes to pass. In fact, I think you were even telling me that more and more prescriptions are on the rise for, anti-stress and anti-anxiety medication.
Yeah, so two responses to that. There have been various studies that indicated that overall medical treatment, particularly routine treatment, even emergency care, decreased during the lockdown. However, studies have pointed that psych visits for children actually increased during this time period. Perhaps an indication of the regression that we previously mentioned, perhaps an indication of the stress that these children are experiencing. There was an article we read, I think we're discussing, Garrick, where one child with autism was wandering out of the house and unfortunately became aggressive and the police got involved. And the mother in this article, she indicated that she had no other outlets. He didn't meet the criteria for inpatient psychiatric hospitalization. Indeed, she'd try that. She indicated that the emergency rooms would just indicate to her that there was nothing that they could do. And so this particular article that we read, she got to the point where her son was being so physical that she had no choice but, unfortunately, to have the police take her son away for the night or however long it was. And along those lines, in terms of medicating the children with disabilities, in many articles that you read, doctors have noticed that even parents who were previously reluctant to prescribe their children medication had felt no other choice but to turn to that. Perhaps, again, a representation of their desperation, so to speak, in dealing with this lockdown. Another thing I think that we discussed before was children with mental health disabilities, they're not really able to perceive oftentimes social boundaries. In the scenario in which you have the children going to the playgrounds or even returning to in-person schooling, when you have a child who doesn't necessarily understand social boundaries, you have on top of that almost a fear of being close to people for fear of spreading the virus. I think, Garrett, you might have experienced something similar like that, or
Yeah,
possibly.
it's an interesting situation to be sure. I live in a small neighborhood here, and across the street, the gentleman across the street, he has some children. One's about Rowan's age, but obviously, because my wife's been pregnant, we're keeping social distance and trying to honor that aspect as well as the neighbors' wishes as well. But since they're all brothers, they'll be out front playing together, building snowmen or what have you. And my son's just watching from the window, and all he wants to do is go over there and play. And that's where we stand, and that's where I started experiencing that kind of anxiety where it's like, they're just kids. Why can't they play together? They haven't gone anywhere. We haven't gone anywhere. This should be fine. You start rationalizing in your head why it's not a problem. Why can't they play together? But then you always have to take in context, right? You never know. And that I think becomes the biggest problem that, we as adults, as citizens, as people every day, especially because as humans, we're communal, right? We're all about communities. That's why we have cities and towns, right? And here, my son and his friends are separated by 10 feet of street and they can't hang out. And he can't go and hang out with them. And it kills him. And because he wants to do that, I can't let him because I have to make a choice. And I don't want to be responsible if he were to get ill or something could get passed or whatever. So it's definitely a difficult situation to be in. And even when we go to playgrounds, now that kind of brings me to how we've been coping with it, right? Because this is all stuff that most people know. I mean, I don't want to sit here and beat a dead horse, But one of the biggest things and the big takeaways is it did help us understand our own ways of being able to cope with it. And one of the things we try to do is, we would go to the playground because the playground's open back up and you could go there. You have to wear a mask. Of course, we do that. But the problem becomes is different people view each other differently, right? Some folks out there, and it's just been my personal experience, they have their children, and my son, he doesn't understand social boundaries. He doesn't understand personal space. It's not what he understands. He runs up to people, he gets in your face, he's very energetic, he wants to say hi. Well, that's all good when they're just kids. But when you have this fear and this looming of this potential pandemic, who's infected, who's not, right? In the back of your mind, all of a sudden he's running up to another child on the playground. Now, granted, they both have masks, but immediately both myself, the parent of my son, and the parent of the other child, we're like rushing in to try to intercede, like, whoa, 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 give some space. And now we feel really awkward. And it creates this very unhappy anxiety where you don't even feel like you can go out to the playground to enjoy it because you constantly have to be on the prowl. And unfortunately, we've even seen where some children show up and they're not wearing masks. They're outdoors, but they're not wearing masks. And the parents, they just get so hostile with each other. And it gets tough to even want to go to the playground, right? Even for that reprieve and that moment to get outdoors and burn some energy off, you don't even want to do that. So some of the things that we've been doing personally to kind of help fill this gap, provide him his therapy services as needed, is we've been starting to build a routine around what we call no electronics or a family hour, or pick whatever name you'd like for it. But effectively what we do is, after work, I work for an extra hour, last minute emails, whatever. When that's done, we sit together, just, me and my son will start first, and we shut off cell phones and we don't get on the computer, no television or anything like that. And we sit, we play. We'll play, I try to focus on fine motor skill plays. So that would be doing puzzles. It would be playing board games that involve small pieces. There's like a Don't Break the Ice, if you remember that game, or Don't Spill the Beans, a couple of those old games out there, as well as a lot of Legos, play with a lot of Legos. And sitting there and working with him to follow instructions to build certain things. We have the little picture book of the different cars and planes or whatever that you can build. They sell this big kind of generic Lego box that just has random stuff in it. And you build houses or what have you. Or we draw. I'll give him things to draw and I'll copy what he's drawing, or he'll try to copy what I'm drawing. And then after, we take a break for dinner, and then we do it all again with my wife involved as well. And it's been a great way to at least help relieve the stress and give him that social time, because it is, again, really hard with a 3-week-old baby that does require that kind of attention. And then I'm trying to work from home and focus on work. Having that dedicated time carved out is helpful. But it is one thing that we have been able to do. Another thing we've been doing a lot of is just going for regular walks around the neighborhood. We go for bike rides or scooter rides. He loves riding his scooter, so we go out. There's a big parking lot nearby that's always empty, and we go there, and he just goes as fast as he can in big circles, and we race and do those things. And we keep in touch via Skype meetings and Zoom calls with his cousins and things like that to keep them playing. And it's working, but it's not a replacement.
Well, your family is an example that highlights how important parents are in a child's life. And, at the end of the day, it really does come down to parents and family. What you've touched upon in terms of trying to maintain some sense of optimism. And as with the change in year from 2020, which we'd all like to forget, to 2021, maybe there's a light at the end of the tunnel. And maybe this optimism that you as a parent and me as a parent have tried to just maintain throughout this entire lockdown, so to speak, will have us prepared for when things get back to some sense of normalcy, whenever that might be. And I also, Garrick, I wanted to thank you for sharing your personal experience. I know certainly hasn't been easy for you, but I hope that our listeners could take some things away from this podcast. And I wanted to thank everyone for taking the time to listen to this. This has been another Empowering Plans podcast. We look forward to recording another podcast in the future.